Hello, everybody, and welcome back to episode number 8 of the Jank Tank. My name is Timothy Zaccanino. I'm joined here by both of the boys, Christopher Sofsky and Teld, are on the line. How are we doing today, guys? Sorry, behind the scenes, I kept them waiting for an hour because I overslept, so...
We still love you.
I know, all good, man. I'm just finishing off that second cup of coffee this morning. I've been up for like 5 hours. These guys are just getting up.
Yeah. There's a 3-hour time gap now between me and them, so I guess I'm still in the adjustment phase of that, even though I've been here for like 4 months now. It's hard. The sun sets at 4:15 here.
Oh, Jesus. Wow.
It's crazy.
Well, we appreciate you getting used to this schedule and continuing to make this podcast with us.
You know, when I was living in the Netherlands, it was like exactly the same way in the dead of winter. Like, we'd get out of school at like 3:30, and by the time I got home at 4 o'clock, the sun was down, and it would not just down, but like it was pitch black outside. The flip side, I guess, is in the summertime, you're going to have like a couple days where it like basically never gets dark.
Yeah, though they tell me here that there is no summertime. Although that's, I don't know. I guess Washington does have summer now, and they've just started experiencing summer over the last 10 years or something. There's no, I was telling Teld last time, not to get into it on the episode, but they don't have heating in a lot of the buildings here because they never had hot summer, or they don't have
air conditioning,
AC rather, because they never had hot summers, and now that summers actually are hot in Washington, people are like, what do we do? How do we cool ourselves down? They don't have sweet tea. Like, what are you supposed to do, drink water?
It's always kind of amazed me that sweet tea is a big deal in the South, because like syrupy, thick beverages are not fantastic for super hot weather. You know, actually a lot of Southern food is just like heavy and creamy and fried, and it's just like 105 degrees outside, and it's just like, how did we arrive at this point? I don't know.
Yeah,
it's just funny to me.
Probably going to commit Southern heresy, but unsweet tea is just, it's superior to sweet tea.
Okay, well, anyway, we're going to go ahead and get into this episode here. So, you've read the title already, whatever that title ends up being. We are talking about tempo today. And actually what happened was we had the really long set review last time, and we were kind of brainstorming what should we talk about for kind of a shorter, more succinct episode. And Chris was like, let's talk about tempo. And I was super stoked about that. I got out the old keyboard and drum set. We had Teld on back-end vocals, released a EP, you know, booked a gig at the Ritz-Carlton, and then day of the show, Chris was
at the
like...
Ritz, huh?
Yeah, which I think might be a hotel. I don't know what the Ritz-Carlton is. This is coming off the top of the head, you know? But anyway, day of the show, Chris was like, no, tempo and magic. And I was like, oh, okay. Well, put away all the old musical equipment, and... here we are talking about tempo in Magic, whatever that means. We'll get into it. We're talking about tempo specifically in Cube, though we will do our best to talk about what tempo is, which is a tried and true topic at this point in the Magic community. Before we do that, remember, you can come find us in our Discord server, which is linked to wherever you're listening to this. We are also on Spotify now, though... I have gotten some feedback that the new episodes go up late on Spotify for whatever reason, so you might get the Spotify version a couple days after the Libsyn version or wherever else that's sent to. You can always find us on YouTube the day the podcast releases as well. We usually make a good Reddit post shouting out our new episodes. So, best place to find us, though, is the Discord server, where you can come actually play Cube with us, direct challenge permitting. And sometimes you'll win some gems with Matcherino permitting. So, you know, there's some bugs in the process sometimes lately due to the way direct challenge is bugged on Arena, but hopefully they fix that at some point.
Before we hop in, I just want to be clear. We're going to spend a little bit of time on the overall concept of tempo in Magic, but that's been really broadly covered by a lot of professional Magic players and a lot of like really experienced Magic theorists. So we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about like the generalized concept of tempo, but what we're mostly going to be talking about in this episode is how to design blue creature decks in Cube.
More like what we think tempo is, or how we would define tempo to set a backdrop for how we would design tempo in Cube, you know? So that's going to be the goal today. And of course, since we're talking about tempo, I'm going to edit this at 1.5 times speed. So if the voices sound accelerated, that's on purpose.
I'll probably still sound like Eeyore.
Tim also sent us all metronomes and told us, set them to 120 beats a minute, and that's the pace you got to talk for the entire episode.
Man, I was pushing for 180. Techno, baby.
We're really pacing this one out. And I think with that, I'm out of tempo jokes that I had slotted in for this episode. But anyway.
Sorry if they were a little low value for you people.
It's fine. It's fine. They got Yeast Within on an episode. That's the best they're ever going to get. All right, the age-old question. I'm going to throw it to you guys. What is tempo? What does tempo mean?
I'm going to let Teld talk about this.
Yeah, so the way I usually describe it is it's winning mana advantage against the opponent. So the classic example is your opponent plays a bear on turn 2 and you bolt it for 1 mana. You've generated a 1 mana advantage in tempo. So it kind of necessarily impacts the relationship to the board. And it gets a little muddy when you start talking about cards with all their various abilities that aren't exactly, it isn't a bear versus a bolt anymore, right? Your bear has text on it that sometimes does other things. But usually it's like the idea of getting larger and larger net mana advantages, because the more net mana you spend, the higher your odds of winning. But like that has to actually come into play of being impactful on the board. So like the example of the 2-drop versus the 1-drop burn spell, your 2-drop didn't actually net you any mana, right? You net lost mana because the bolt countered it. So that's kind of the general thing. And almost every deck plays around with this concept to a certain extent, even to the point of Wraths, right? Like if your 4-mana Wrath kills 2 3-drops, right? You've generated tempo, and control decks are looking to cash that in to use their card draw, right? They want to use that mana advantage to create windows for their card draw. Aggressive decks typically use that tempo advantage to push damage, but every deck to a certain extent cares about tempo. And that would be kind of the way I would describe it. It basically necessarily involves the board, and it's about trading mana for mana.
Yeah, there's a Reed Duke quote here that I had, which basically said that, he tried to define tempo as board presence. This was back in 2014, so that's a 10-year-old definition from Reed Duke there. But he said, we call it tempo because of the way the two players are jockeying for resources dictates the pace of the game. I've also heard some people say that tempo is short for temporary because you're getting temporary advantages sometimes off of things. And I think that only half describes what tempo is. But there is another quote I wanted to give here real quick from Tom Anderson, which is newer. It's from 2021. And he was saying that tempo is the advantage gained by spending mana more effectively than your opponent. And I think that's what people gravitate towards, right? As a basic example, if you spend 3 mana to draw 3 cards, I spend 3 mana to draw 2 cards, I used my 3 mana better. Though he does go on to say that tempo is at odds with card advantage, and usually when we think of tempo, we're thinking of giving up card advantage or giving up long-term value for some sort of short-term gain. And in that regards, it's like an aggro deck, but we'll talk a little bit more extensively about the differences between aggro and tempo and stuff like that. But
you can also kind of tell this quote is a couple of years old because of that idea.
Yeah, and his idea was basically in that article, you have to give up card advantage to get tempo, but now in 2023, that's not necessarily true. Sometimes you get tempo and card advantage at the same time on like 3-drops and stuff like that. So that's just the state of Magic. We were literally just talking about this before we hit record, that we could do a whole episode on, how Magic has changed. And maybe we will at some point. And that's one way that Magic has definitely changed in the modern era, is that you can get tempo and card advantage at the same time, but
unless you're blue.
Yeah, unless you're blue. Do you want to expand on anything here about what tempo means?
Well, I think in cubes, and actually when describing constructed decks, I think that tempo is typically used to describe a couple of actually different strategies that are in my opinion, like pretty different from one another. It's almost always a blue deck, and it's almost always a blue deck that features small creatures as opposed to a control deck that would, generally speaking, like never do that. That's how the term tempo generally gets used when we're talking about decks. In terms of like my concept of what tempo is broadly as a concept in Magic, I think Teld really hit the nail on the head. It's generating mana advantage. Now there's like a couple different ways you can do that. Actually, Teld, do you want to cover tempo in green? Because I think that you have kind of you can articulate this idea better than I can.
Yeah, sure. So green isn't often associated with tempo, but modern green creatures particularly have incredible tempo, and there's kind of two aspects of this. So when we talk about tempo, very frequently things like bounce spells are referred to as tempo cards because they trade card resources, right? You go down a card to gain a mana advantage. Your unsummon costing 1 mana, bouncing a Wormcoil Engine is a huge mana win, right? But in that regard, mana dorks are kind of in the same facet where your mana dork is functionally trading most of a card because a 1/1 Llanowar Elves isn't actually a real magic card in most scenarios, but it generates mana. So if you tap your Llanowar Elves for mana 3 times, it generated a pretty substantial mana advantage in the game. And then your bigger green creatures, your 3+ drops, typically are overstated and they jockey for board really well, whether it be through their effects or just their raw stat size. They're able to essentially just fight for board super well. And oftentimes they come along with card advantage and create that scenario where you're no longer having to choose between good mana investment and like card advantage. You're just getting everything up front. So I think green on both fronts has very good tempo in Magic.
Yeah. And to expand on that a little bit, like, this might seem a little broad, but huge green creatures, especially 5-drops, the 5-drops that they're printing these days, tend to represent a tempo advantage insofar as, like, you're spending 5 mana, but you're generally speaking getting a creature that's, like, in other colors worth a lot more than 5 mana. You know what I mean? And it's interesting, too, like, again, we alluded to the idea that the game of Magic has changed, and, you know, Tim mentioned that these days you can actually generate tempo and board presence sort of at the same time, or you don't have to sacrifice advantage. Like, I know I keep shouting this card out, but like 5 mana Vorinclex is like a perfect example of the fact that they are printing cards now where like you're not sacrificing any tempo. I mean, it's a stat monster. It's a 6/6 trample reach for 5, but it's also drawing 2 cards, right? So like the idea that generating tempo, you're basically like sacrificing resources in the interest of generating a mana advantage. Like that whole concept in Magic is like slowly eroding, especially as it relates to gigantic green threats.
And it's not just a blue thing, right? Like, you're talking about green tempo advantage. I don't think most people will think of a mana dork as a tempo play, but there is a way to think of it that way. But I think, you know, it is, as you said, Chris, associated with blue, like, 100% of the time. Like, if you see somebody at the Pro Tour and they've got, like, blank, blank tempo deck as the title of their deck, it probably includes blue. That's just the way people think about it. But you can have tempo in all colors. Well, tempo exists, at least as a concept, in all colors.
In every game of Magic.
Yeah, exactly. I do find it funny that like somebody would show up with their like Llanowar Elves Craterhoof Behemoth deck and be like, "This is my green tempo." You know,
if I'm being uncharitable, I think the phrase tempo deck is often used to describe a blue aggro deck. But how do I put this? Skilled Magic players or like higher level Magic players don't want to say that their blue deck is just an aggro deck, so they call it a tempo deck. But I think if I'm being more charitable to that, tempo decks are defined kind of by their choice to trade some amount of speed for like reliability of their interaction. So it doesn't matter that Delver of Secrets kills you in 7 turns instead of 4 if you're able to hold up Daze, Force of Will, and then bolt any creature your opponent slips through, right? It trades a little bit of that speed for its interaction being much more universally applicable.
And Chris, you have a note here about power in Cube being, you know, synonymous with speed / tempo.
Yeah, so this is like, I don't know if everybody would agree with this, but I think when people talk about power in Cube, they're simultaneously talking about speed, right? I think that's demonstrated by the fact that higher power formats, games tend to be shorter, right? I don't know if either of you would push back on that, but I think like the number of turns that a typical, you know, modern game lasts is probably shorter than the number of turns that a typical standard game would last. At least that's been like traditionally true. I don't know if it's true anymore.
Well, no, modern is currently defined by a deck that like functionally wins the game on turn 1. Like when you get scammed, you just kind of lose the game on the spot.
Yeah, exactly. And that's really powerful, which is to say that it wins the game really fast, right? So that's just something I wanted to point out. Like, tempo is increasingly the defining characteristic of the most powerful decks in Magic. For example, like if you think about it this way, like Adeline is kind of a tempo card. Okay, this is probably a good way to put it. Any creature that snowballs really hard is essentially generating tempo, it's generating speed, and that's why it's powerful. Does that make sense?
I generally agree with your idea of power and speed being pretty related. A good example is the most powerful format in Magic is Vintage, right? And what defines Vintage is the fact that they have a bunch of fast mana. All the fast mana that's banned in every other format is legal there, and it leads to a lot of turn 1, turn 2 kills.
Yep.
Yeah, fast mana, just like the mana dorks, is actually a pretty good indication of, you know, a tempo style build, just because you are giving up a card to get like some sort of mana source on board, but you get such a huge advantage from that. You know, like a Lotus Petal is a very good example of, I guess, a tempo play, because you're just straight up down a card for a single mana, you know, not even a repeatable source of mana, but just I'm going down a card, my Simian Spirit Guide, I'm going down a card, but I'm going to try to get out as fast as possible and do this thing. Usually you're doing something really unfair with those cards specifically, but I don't know if you would call like turn 1 combo decks a tempo deck just because they win on turn 1. That's kind of a different category of deck, but
sure. But to your point, part of what made, like, for example, the original cycle of Phyrexian mana spells like Gutshot and Mutagenic Growth are kind of ridiculous Magic cards, even if they're low-key ridiculous, but it's because they cost 0 mana, right? And so you're able to leverage advantage. The fact that they do anything for 0 mana is really effective. Mishra's Bauble is kind of in the same way. It's a consistently super playable card because it does something for 0 mana that decks can leverage.
Right.
So when we think of tempo, we think of the blue creature decks, especially in modern day, since the blue threats have been pushed kind of not quite equal to the threats in other colors, but we do have like actual good blue threats set after set now. Let's talk about these blue creature decks. Just maybe some typical standard / constructed decks that people might be familiar with that fall into the line with tempo, and kind of what defines them, what actually makes them what we would call a tempo deck.
Okay, so this is kind of a pet topic for me, so if you guys don't mind, I'll take this one.
No, but we do have to notch the metronome up to 1.75 now.
Okay. Get Chris's section done as quickly as possible. So, like I said earlier, when people generally refer to decks as tempo decks, either in like constructed or cube, what they're kind of generally talking about most of the time is some kind of blue deck that is leveraging creatures to win the game. Like, it might not necessarily be a quote-unquote creature deck insofar as it's playing like 16 creatures, but the win condition is generally like a collection of smaller creatures rather than like a big finisher or, you know, like a creature land or something that a control deck would typically use to win the game. And I think that there are multiple different, very distinct strategies that get referred to both as tempo decks, even though like their game plan is actually quite different. So the first is disruptive aggro decks. So it's basically, at its root, it's a blue aggro deck. They always want to execute the exact same game plan and basically ignore what you're doing, which is basically the hallmark of aggro decks. The difference between these decks and pure aggro decks, what makes them sort of interactive decks, is they always want to do the same thing, but what they're trying to do is keep you off of being able to interact with it. So one of these decks is like Classic Delver, which is actually, Tel, do you want to take Classic Delver away because you're more familiar with it than I am?
Yeah, so when we say Classic Delver, we're referring to the Legacy Delver decks, typically the Rug Delver or Blue-Red Delver, where their game plan is to stick like a Delver of Secrets, a Nimble Mongoose, a Dragon Rage Channel, or something like that. And then they're going to back it up with Force of Will, Lightning Bolt, Daze, Wastelands, that sort of thing. And they're trying to kill you relatively quickly, but they're not full bore aggro in that their game plan is trying to slow down the pace of the game and stifle your resources. They used to actually play the card Stifle for fetch lands. And that's kind of their game plan, right? It's going to be kill you over the course of like 6 or 7 turns, maybe less depending on how many creatures they have in their hand. And we're just going to have just enough disruption to get us across the finish line, as opposed to trading 1-for-1 with your removal by just playing more creatures.
So that's Classic Delver. Another like really classic style of tempo deck is what I call the typal disruptive aggro decks, and those include like Spirits and Merfolk and things like that. And I think sometimes these are referred to as like fish decks, for lack of a better way to do it, because I think that the first deck that kind of combined creatures and counter magic was sort of like the Merfolk deck, if I'm not mistaken, which is why they call it fish. So, like, Spirits, for example. Spirits, you know, I don't know what Spirits looks like anymore, but it used to play, like, Mausoleum Wanderer, which is, like, an on-board counter spell. It's also a 1-drop flyer to chip in damage. And then you play your 2-drop, and then you resolve, like, what is it called? Drogskull Captain to buff your entire board. So this is, like, it's playing a Lord. Like, it's very much an aggressive deck, but it's playing disruptive elements like Rattle Chains, which is a 2-1 flash flyer that comes down, and on ETB it makes one of your Spirits hexproof. It's blanking a removal spell while adding a 2-1 to the board, which is a very serious tempo swing, right? Your 2-mana play did absolutely nothing to affect my board, and now I have an additional 2 power in the air on board. The thing about these decks is that Wizards tends to print effects that are dependent on creature types, so they can push the power of those disruptive elements while limiting the threats that you can play in those decks to like a select number of cards that they've printed. I can't remember what it's called, but there's like a 2-mana counter spell that they printed in some recent set that I think it only taxes for like 1, but if you have a flyer, it taxes for 4.
Lofty Denial.
Lofty Denial, right. So 2 mana better than Mana Leak is a really powerful counter spell, but you have to be playing flying creatures in your deck in order for it to be that, right? So they push these effects, and this is why they tend historically to be sort of creature typal decks. They push these effects by like limiting you to a certain slate of threats that you can back that or back up with that style of counter magic. Another example of these disruptive aggro decks, and some of you may remember Reed Duke and I believe Autumn Burchett at a PT playing a mono blue mirror. That deck was what we call curiosity decks, in Cube. Like there'll be like a curiosity, a curious obsession, maybe like a coastal piracy effect that says when your creature does damage to your opponent, you draw cards. That's like probably the best way to leverage flying men. In this particular deck, back in the Dominaria era standard, you were basically trying to stick a 1/1 unblockable, which is not a good 1-mana investment. But then the next turn, you would stick a Curious Obsession with it, attack, and draw a card, and hold up 1 mana for a spell called Dive Down that made target creature hexproof and gave it +0/+2 or +0/+3 or something like that. And then the point of the entire deck is to just keep that creature alive. It's aggressive because it's an early play that's beating you to death, but it's simultaneously drawing so many cards that your opponent's never going to run out of counterspells and is just never going to be able to interact with it. So these, again, I would define all of these as aggressive decks, but they are trying to keep you off of disrupting their aggression.
Those 1-mana protection spells like Dive Down, and I think one of the more popular ones these days is Slip Out the Back. If you have those in your deck, you're probably a tempo deck. Like you're just willing to throw away an entire card just to keep one of your threats around, and that card gives you almost no long-term advantage. Dive Down counters a spell, and that's it. You're not using it to push damage, nothing like that. So if you have those cards in your deck, you are almost necessarily a tempo deck.
So what all of these aggro decks, these disruptive aggro decks, have in common for cube purposes is that if you want to include them in your environment, they are typically going to take up a lot of real estate as very parasitic cards, because including things like Flying Men or a specific, typal theme or these Delver very tempo heavy decks requires a lot of space for cards that don't really have homes quite frequently in other in other decks.
Yeah, and we're going to cover that in more detail when we get to how you translate these blue creature deck styles into designing your cube. But yeah, that is definitely true. These style of decks tend to include, if you're going to build them in your cube, they tend to include a lot of effects that literally no other strategy is going to touch or play.
Though that too has changed. We'll talk about some new cards we've gotten recently that fit into this line, and you talk about like your Kite Sail Larcenist and your Subterranean Schooner, and I imagine any blue deck could play those. Doesn't have to be tempo or anything, You're not making a lot of concessions to put a card like Subterranean Schooner in a cube, I don't think.
Yeah, the thing here would be like your Flying Men or things like that.
Yeah.
Your Dive Downs, your Curiosities, yeah.
Yeah, you're putting Mausoleum Wanderer in your cube. Like, you're doing something very specific that's probably going to eat up, 4, 5, 6 slots in your blue section that you otherwise wouldn't be playing.
Yep. The other style of blue creature deck that commonly I think gets referred to as a tempo deck is what I think can be more accurately referred to as aggro control. So Modern Fairies is like an absolute classic in this space. You're not actually playing a ton of creatures. They're all fairies, obviously, but you're also playing Bitter Blossom, which once you stick Bitter Blossom, it's just producing a 1/1 flyer every single turn. And it is a typal deck insofar as it plays like Spell Stutter Sprite, which is a 2-mana 1/1 flyer that taxes your opponent's mana, like in a counterspell style way for every fairy that you control. So it is a typal deck. But this deck is playing like Cryptic Command and Mana Leak and things like that, in an effort to basically stick 1 or 2 fairies and beat you to death with them while killing your small plays and countering your bigger plays and drawing cards and just letting their Bitter Blossom kill you while they control what you're doing, which is a very different game plan than, sticking disruptive creatures that protect other creatures and then backing it up with an Anthem to beat you to death. It's a much slower, more mid-rangey style that is, rather than focusing on protecting what you are doing from your opponent's interaction, it is interacting with what your opponent is trying to do while it is establishing some form of board presence to win the game. So it's going to feature more instants and sorceries that control the game, and your role really depends on the matchup. UB Fairies is a really classic example of this. There was a blue-red Drakes. Actually, I don't know if either one of you guys want to talk about any of these decks in particular. I wasn't around for Cawblade, but I definitely played. I definitely played blue-red Drakes, and blue-red Drakes I think had 8 creatures in it.
What was that? The Enigma Drake, Cackling Drake?
Crackling Drake?
Yeah, usually it was like 9 to 10. You usually played a couple of copies of the red, blue, Niv Mizzet.
Gotcha.
Sure.
So all you're trying to do in these decks is like stick a flyer that has massive power if you have a bunch of instants and sorceries in your deck, and then you're just trying to counter what your opponent's doing, burn out their small creatures, and just keep your Drakes alive and win the game.
Some of these are a little fuzzy, like Blue Red Drakes, you could argue is more of this class, like style of tempo deck, even though it was a very board control-y deck. I did have some experience with like Callblade, Stoneblade type decks, and those are kind of what I think people typically imagine when they say aggro control, mostly because those decks tend to be centered in the kind of like, if you are like a 1 to 10 aggro to control spectrum, they're kind of situated in like, a little slightly to the control side, but kind of close to the middle. Blue-Black Fairies is probably the best example of one that's like dead center, right? That deck would, depending on your hand and like what your opponent has, could take a very controlling role or it could take a very aggressive role. And it just kind of depended. But these decks have a thing of typically being fan favorites. These are decks that like skilled players typically like when Blue-Black Rogues was in standard, there was a Gruul deck and this deck that were both very, very powerful. And despite the Gruul deck having being very easy to play and extremely popular on the ladder, every time the Pro Tour came around, the Blue-Black Rogues deck was overrepresented by a lot, if I recall correctly, just because pros really liked playing it. And if you were a very skilled pilot, it gave you more room to outplay your opponent.
I think one of the hallmarks of like the fairy deck too is it plays almost entirely at instant speed, which is something that is going to matter a lot when we talk about these tempo cards in cube. The more your deck is able to operate at instant speed, the better. And you'll notice usually flash meant that you lost like a point of power on your flyer or something like that. And I don't even think that's true anymore. You just get 2 mana 2/1 flash flyers now. So you're not even really compromising to play at instant speed.
Though to be fair, 2 mana at sorcery speed gets you like a 2/4 or bigger these days with a Ledger Shredder.
Yeah, or Subterranean Scooter. But I'm going to complain about that card a lot moving forward. But classic tempo effects, like the quintessential tempo creature is Mana War. That's the one that people seem to think of whenever you talk about tempo. You use 3 mana, you get on board, and you eat up whatever mana that your opponent spent on their creature. Of course, ETBs, you can value that however you want. I think the other one is Unsummon, or Fading Hope, I guess is strictly better. Unsummon. Vapor Snag's another one. Basically, throwing away a card to just get an expensive creature off board. You're down a card, but you're up on mana. And then the cheap counterspells. Magic often designs counterspells that are literally meant to be tempo spells. So when you're thinking of your Spell Pierce, your 1 mana instant that counters your opponent's 2, 3, 4 mana spell, or a great example is Spell Snare, which is a single blue mana to counter a 2 mana spell specifically. Like necessarily when you cast that, you're getting a mana advantage off of it because of the way it's designed. Disdainful Stroke is another one that they reprint over and over and over again because they don't want to give us good counter magic. That's 2 mana to counter anything that costs 4 mana and up. And obviously there's a trade-off with that one in that it doesn't work in the first 3 turns of the game, but when you do eventually get to the point where you can cast a Disdainful Stroke, like you get way up on tempo. Your opponent casts their big 6-drop play, you Disdainful Stroke it. It's like the biggest mana advantage you can think of. So those cheap counter spells often slot in, and tempo decks don't really load up on counter spells. That's how they differentiate from a straight up control deck. A control deck will often play, tons of counter spells. It'll play every counter spell it can get its hand on, as well as like 2-for-1 card draw and stuff like that. Tempo decks, I don't think load up on counter magic, but they usually have just enough in their deck to interact with whatever your opponent's trying to cast to stop you. Same goes for those white counterspells like Mana Tithe and Reprieve, which are arguably even better. I mean, I think absolutely better in a tempo deck than they are in a control deck, because you're pressing some sort of advantage, whereas in control you're usually not. You're just countering for the sake of making sure your opponent's things don't resolve. In a tempo deck, you're countering so that you can actually kill your opponent on the next turn.
Like, it's in the same way that, like, Unsummon is just kind of bad in control decks because you're going down a card, but you're not actually leveraging the fact that you generated a tempo advantage all that well because you don't have threats on board that are punishing your opponent for being a step behind now.
Exactly. Yeah, so there you go. That's the new definition of tempo that everyone's going to be using going forward. Sorry, Reed Duke. Sorry, Tom Anderson, but we nailed it. It only took us 40 minutes or whatever. All right, Cube. Let's transition to talking about Cube. Now that everybody knows exactly what tempo is, let's talk about how you get tempo decks into your cube, how they perform, and what they look like. How you actually slot tempo decks into your cube, assuming that you intentionally want tempo in.
If you want,
there might be a chance that you just play good blue cards and blue white cards, and there just happens to be a blue white tempo deck without you even trying. But let's say you want to be intentional and you want to make sure that there are tempo decks in your cube. How do we go about doing that? What do they look like?
So we're going to talk about both of the styles that we mentioned earlier. We're going to talk about how to insinuate like a disruptive aggro deck into your cube and sort of what the pitfalls and purposes behind doing that are. And then we're also going to talk about how to insinuate an aggro control deck into your cube. So typically a disruptive aggro deck in a lot of cubes is going to feature flying men, like 1-mana, 1/1 flyers. Generally speaking, they come with a little bit of upside these days. What this style of deck, and again, this is like how you generally do it broadly in Cube, is you're playing flying men, which are generally not really worth a card on their own. And then you're trying to leverage the fact that you have these evasive creatures in play. And generally speaking, the way that you do that is to play cards like Curiosity and Curious Obsession, which enchant your creature and make it so when they deal combat damage to a player, you draw a card. There's also a 3-mana blue creature from, I believe, AFR called Grazilax, and it has some kind of like weird bounce text on it, but what the card mostly does is when your creatures deal combat damage to your opponent, you draw cards. So this is how you turn your flying men into like actual cards that are worth more than 1 mana, is you make them into card advantage engines.
Yeah, in this way, they're kind of facilitators or enablers for the powerful Curiosity Coastal Piracy effect payoffs, which those cards, if you're able to have them be unchecked, are extremely powerful cards in Magic, right? Like drawing an extra card every turn is very good. It's just that you have to play all these terrible cards to facilitate them.
Yeah, we're reaching back pretty far with Coastal Piracy here too. That's like before my time. They've upgraded that effect so much these days, but I think people do still call them Coastal Piracy effects. You know, Biden of Thassa, Reconnaissance Mission, Grazilax is a good example. Is Toski, Bearer of Secrets, a tempo card?
I think so.
I mean, it does the same thing, right?
Well, it's after the turn you play it, it's not blocking, right?
No, it's not. It must attack. How do these pan out in Cube? You don't actually see the Flying Man style deck in cubes that often, though. In fact, we had it in our cube for a very long time and found out that people weren't interested in playing it, even though we went out of our way to support it.
Shockingly, putting terrible cards in your deck is not a popular strategy.
Lantern Bearer is not a terrible card.
Lantern Bearer lives on in our emoji.
Well, what's the problem with it?
So these cards don't attack or block well. They are evasive, so they are able to attack, but when you're dealing 1 point of damage per turn, your opponent who played a 2-mana 3/3 or whatever we get now in Magic, it doesn't hold up. And so you need some sort of payoff. Like, you could conceivably sidestep these with like equipment and enchantments, like a pants archetype or something. But again, you're just adding more and more parasitic cards because now you have to put these enchantments that are kind of bad in your decks or in your cube in order to put them on your flying men. So it's kind of an issue of like, they're not really disruptive. So the combo decks, if you have that, or like the more control-y decks, don't really care. You give your control opponent plenty of time to find enough answers. And if you're playing against an aggressive deck, they just run you over because Monastery Swiftspear is going to kill you a lot faster than a flying man will.
Yeah, you've got a really soft matchup into aggro with these decks. Another example that there are creature typal, like I know ninjas was popular for a while, and ninjas is kind of different, right? You're still using flying men a lot because you're trying to sneak in your ninjas via ninjutsu and generate some kind of tempo advantage from having your flying men bring in that ninja for cheaper than it would ordinarily cost and actually get it in for its deal damage to, a player trigger, which is generally speaking what ninjas do, either if they're drawing cards or they're bouncing creatures or what have you. There was a good example of this in, obviously, like the newest Kamigawa set. Like, the Ninjas deck was kind of like a tempo-y deck. So you were trying to basically get as many copies of Network Disruptor as possible so you could, tap down your opponent's blockers and get attackers through that had already resolved and were on board, but also to attack with them, pick them back up, have a ninja enter the battlefield for, cheaper than it's supposed to and generate some kind of advantage. And one of the things that makes flying men in these decks really effective is if you're playing flying men that generate some kind of effect when they ETB, whether it's like Fairy Seer, which scries 2, Network Disruptor that taps down a creature, the new one that makes a map token. If you're going to be doing ninjas in your cube, I think you really want to focus on flying men that bring some kind of value in when you replay them, because that mitigates sort of the disadvantage of having to spend mana again to get those back on board. Ninjas, in my opinion, suffers from the same problem that the classic Curiosity Coastal Piracy decks do, which is that blue-black ninjas go in the blue-black ninja deck. And you don't really play them anywhere else. And we also found that, at least in our higher power cube, that the archetype just didn't really hang with just good stuff green decks that would just kick the crap out of them and stuff like that, because you're trying to do this finicky thing and the payoff is kind of there. So what I would say is if you're interested in the style of deck, if a blue disruptive or coastal piracy style aggro deck is appealing to you, I'm not trying to make it sound like you shouldn't do that. What I would say is I think you need to accept that it's going to eat up some of your blue section, playing cards that don't really go anywhere else. And you're also, I think, going to have to accept that this is probably good in peasant environments or lower power environments where maybe you're intentionally playing weaker removal, because these decks, once you get their moving pieces kind of picked apart, they just don't really do a whole lot. So just be aware. I don't think that this translates very well to higher power cubes.
Once you get to the point where you have to actually sorcery speed cast your ninjas, you're done, right?
Yeah, you're in trouble.
The only way I think this works in the highest power level cubes, if you were to slot this into Legacy Cube or something, is with the actual best ninjas in Magic, which are Fallen Shinobi and Yuriko, the Tiger's Shadow, and stuff like that. Without those cards, even in our peasant environment when we played ninjas, it just feels like the ninjas that exist on the arena sphere, the best possible ninja you can get is the blue-black 2/3, draw a card when it hits, and then once you've done that, it's pretty easy for your opponent to brick wall. Not to mention, if your players are conscious of a ninja deck existing in the cube, it's just easier to play around it. But this was a defining deck in Pauper, too. I don't know if either of you guys keep up with Pauper. I don't know if it's popular anymore, but the whole, play your Fairy Miscreants, your Spell Stutter Sprites, pick them back up with Ninja of the Deep Hour to get some card advantage, and then now you have your Fairy Miscreants and your Spell Stutter Sprites to replay for value and stuff like that. It was maybe the best deck in Pauper for a very long time. I don't even know if it's viable anymore with what's going on there. But yeah, these Ninja-style decks need a lot of support.
It actually still sees some play. That being said, the deck was always really just a Spell Stutter Sprite deck, and so
yeah, it wasn't really a ninja deck. It just had the ninjas in it.
Yeah, the current versions are a blue-black deck that are looking to use Snuff Out and Counterspell and just black removal to push through things so that you can hit with Ninja of the Deep Hours. Some of them play Moon Circuit Hacker. I've seen it be played before, but they aren't ninjas decks. They just leverage the fact that if you're able to keep your opponent's board clear and keep pushing through with your Ninja of the Deep Hours, you get to get a fairly large amount of card advantage.
Yeah, and the typal decks fit into this category too, right? I'm willing to bet we could take our cube and slot in a Spirits deck if we really wanted to go that route. There's enough support for it. You've got cards like Rattle Chains, which fit into enough different decks that you can just play it. You could slot in Shacklegeist or Mausoleum Wanderer. So you could do that. You could play spirits, but you've got to ask yourself the question, like, how parasitic is this? Like, am I putting Shacklegeist in any other deck? I'm using up a lot of cube equity to make sure there's a spirit deck here. Is that what my cube is even about? Some people actually have typal cubes, God bless them.
You have one, don't you?
Yeah, I know. That was a jab at myself.
Okay. Yeah, because I was about to say Spirits is pretty sick if you're playing a creature typal cube where everything is parasitic. That's like the perfect spot if you want to have a tempo style deck in your creature typal cube. Like Spirits is the deck for you 100%.
And it's probably fun, but you don't want to really use up cube equity in a cube that's focusing on macro archetypes to like slot in a typal theme unless it's heavily supported. We tried that with humans in ours too, which I wouldn't say is tempo deck by any means, but
no, it's an aggro deck.
Yeah, the tempo aside, typal decks just don't really get there unless you're willing to use up a lot of your cube equity on cards that aren't necessarily the most flexible thing in the world for your cube.
Yeah, occasionally you can get by with like humans or soldiers being so common that, you throw a couple of payoffs in there and that can work incidentally. But yeah, you have to be very careful about trying to actually make these be like a deck instead of like a small package of cards for a deck.
Yeah, humans is the easiest because, like you said, there are just a million white humans that are really, really good. So you just toss in, like, Champion of the Parish and Thalia's Lieutenant, and, like, you've got these, like, little synergies going already because, like, most of your white cards are humans. And, like, if you put those two payoffs in your white section, you can just bias in favor of humans in some of your other slots without really losing a lot of power because there's so many options. So humans is pretty easy, but, like, putting a zombie deck in your black section in like a macro archetype cube is sort of, generally speaking, going to eat up a lot of space. Like zombies is harder to do than humans is, for example.
For sure. So those are the disruptive aggro decks. How about these aggro control decks?
So we kind of started out with the Curiosity style deck in our own cube. And, like Tim said, nobody drafted it. And then we got the ninjas, and we decided to try to do ninjas, and, like, nobody really drafted that either. I think we have a lot of, like, spiky, high-skilled players in our group, and I think that they just kind of generally like, we were playing that 3-mana ninja, the Naga that comes in, and if it, like, makes contact, it makes a copy of itself, stuff like that. And I just think we found for, like, higher power cubes, people were just, like, not particularly interested in it. So over time, Tim and I really began to recognize that like the best blue creatures were the blue creatures that had flash. And the reason that we like the flash speed creatures is, generally speaking, if you have a control deck in your cube, you're going to be playing counter spells and removal and cantrips. Those are cards that your control deck wants. And flash speed creatures like naturally play well with these effects because they're also instant speed. So not only are you already playing these cards for your control decks, but this makes your counter spells like viable in multiple archetypes, right? They're not just for your control decks anymore. There's this flash creature deck that can leverage those counter spells. So you have agency on how to spend your mana also, because you can just observe what your opponent plays. And if they don't play something worth countering, or it's something that you think you can deal with resolving, you just flash in a threat. Like on turn 3, you hold up a counter spell. Maybe they play like some value 3-drop that you're not particularly scared of because you're confident in your ability to control the value that they're trying to generate later in the game.
Yeah, so like a Fable of the Mirror Breaker or Breaches or something like that,
Right. So you just or Cat Card. There's no reason to counter that. So you just decide, okay, their 3-mana play is something that I can deal with. Like maybe I have a bounce creature that I'm going to play next. So like I know I can bounce that back into their hand. So you just flash and V-click. So you can start clocking them, right? You get to pick your spot on when you're going to deploy your threats. And turn 4 is a really big turn for these decks because a lot of the creatures that you want to play in the style deck cost 2. Ideally, they have flash. Sometimes they don't, but I think that's fine with like a really cheap play. And then you get to hold up counter magic. So if your opponent tries to resolve a questing beast or something like that, you can counter it. Now you've got like your Suspicious Stowaway on board, looting and threatening to become a 2/1 that just draws cards. But you also gained a tempo advantage by countering your opponent's 4-mana play with a 2-mana spell.
Yeah, and part of the reason I think this works so well now is, like I said, you're not paying extra for flash on some of the cards they're designing. like your what is it, Malcolm, the new Malcolm, Alluring Siren, I think is the name of the card, plus Fairy Mastermind. And there might even be another 2-power Flash Fire I'm not thinking of, but those actually clock your opponent, so they can be a game plan in and of themselves while playing into your tempo strategy, whereas like your Spell Stutter Sprite, you have to go pretty hard control because Spell Stutter Sprite's not closing out the game, but as they're pushing the power of these flash threats, which they have been doing, and we get more of those, you can actually play a tempo game that is leveraging just playing things at instant speed, because the instant speed threats are actual threats. Tishana's Wayfinder's another one in this vein that is just a really good flash creature.
Tidebinder.
What did I say? Wave Rider or something?
Something like that.
I made up Merfolk water words, and I hope it sounded right.
Just AI in your head, yeah.
Tishana's surfer dude.
The reason these cards tend to work is they leverage the fact that most of the good blue creatures that they're printing kind of fit into this game plan these days. So you're kind of just playing good cards, right? You're not really playing cards that are parasitic. You're just playing like good blue creatures that they decide to print,
which has not always been the case.
These decks tend to be really good into mid-range and control decks. They're still a little soft to aggro pretty frequently, but like, when you're playing flash creatures plus counter magic, it's very difficult for control to have a good matchup into you. And mid-range also kind of struggles from like, okay, you played a dork on turn 1, or like you played mana dorks in the early game. I resolved like a 2-mana 2/2 or 2/1 flyer, or like a Vendilion Click, and now I'm going to counter the next like 3 plays you do and hit you for 12 damage in the air.
So they tend to be kind of soft to aggro because they're faster than you, and because they're playing so many cheap aggressive creatures, your counter spells are not particularly likely to like trade up on mana. As Teld mentioned, they're pretty great into a lot of mid-range decks that are trying to resolve like one big threat each turn, because it's a lot easier for you to like sneak out a cheap threat and then, counter their larger card to gain a tempo advantage. And it's kind of a game of chicken against control decks.
Yeah, I think there's an element of depending on your supportive color can change the dynamic of it too. Because I think the blue-red decks, for example, are better into aggro because you get cheap burn, but they're worse into control because you don't have as much density of powerful threats. Whereas like the white decks, as your support color, are picking up Avacyn and Restoration Angel and these like big chunkers that can really punish your opponent for having to wrath you or something like that.
Wandering Emperor has flash, so it's like an incredibly powerful card that is awesome in these flash speed aggro control decks. When I play the blue-white version on our own cube, I actually like to main deck Settle the Wreckage, because it is another instant speed card that is excellent against aggro. And paired with Wandering Emperor, it used to be like pretty obvious when you were holding up Settle the Wreckage, but now there's like this mind game, like do I attack with one creature and get kind of blown out by Wandering Emperor, or do I swing out and get blown out? But it could, also be Angel.
Restoration Angel, yeah. It's whichever one you don't play around. I also like putting Settle the Wreckage in my deck so I can loot it away and show my opponent that I had it the whole time. Do you guys, this is a little bit of a side, do you guys think from a cube design perspective that there's anything unhealthy about including like a really strong blue tempo deck in terms of like pushing blue towards creature aggro? Like, it's so easy for every color to just be creature aggro these days. Do you think there's anything unhealthy about it, or anything that you should, like, maybe pull back on so that every deck in your cube is not just, like, a deck that's beaten down or, pushing damage consistently? Like, every deck is pressuring you no matter what color it's in.
So this is kind of the crux of our current design quandaries, right? The fact is that in modern Magic, if you just play all the good cards, your games are going to be exceptionally fast. And we've intentionally cut a number of very powerful cards from the cube, specifically to try to slow down the snowbally pace of games. But it's just a design of modern Magic that every color is playing powerful threats that pressure your life total, to the point that like control decks now are playing 2 and 3 drop, really 3 drop threats to be able to try to compete, as opposed to like really leveraging on wrath sometimes. We can get deeper into this in a future episode, but the game is just fundamentally changing in a way that really continues to push creature-based Magic and continues to push cheaper and cheaper threats. I know, Tim, you've played a lot of LCI, but like we've talked about the number of 2 and 3 mana bombs in that set, and that's just like probably going to be the future of Magic, right?
Yeah, and LCI is an interesting case because it reminds me a lot of Brothers War, where every color was an aggro color. And the thing is, in Cube, as the Cube designer, you have the choice to pull back on that if you wish, right? So my question is not like, if you play all the best blue threats, you're going to have a good blue tempo / aggro deck because the blue threats have gotten better. Maybe, all of the other colors have gotten proportionately better threats because blue has good threats now. But is there ever a point where you say, you know what, I'm not going to include this blue tempo deck because I want to make sure blue's control identity is shining through. I want to make sure the control deck is present, and I don't really want every color to be just like a blister and fast aggro deck.
Well, here's the thing. I don't actually think that if you build your blue creature deck as an aggro control deck, I really don't think it's an aggro deck. Like, these decks don't actually win that fast.
Right.
Because the creatures, like the good creatures have like 2 or more power, but they still don't clock you that quickly because they're not really curving out, right? Like, I see the aggro control deck playing more of a mid-range role in the cube. So that's actually one of the other reasons that I prefer building the blue creature deck as an aggro control deck as opposed to like a disruptive aggro deck, is you're 100% right. Like, if you're trying to build a blue aggro deck, if you're building a traditional cube, you probably have white, red, and like maybe black aggro. And at that point, there's just like an aggro deck in every single color. And I also, not to beat up on the deck too much, but at higher power levels where you're playing rares, where like the 3-drop white and red creatures are completely insane, I think your blue aggro deck is just going to be the worst aggro deck in your cube, generally.
I will say, I think like the base blue creature decks do have a different texture to the gameplay than the regular like red or white aggro. Just like red and white aggro both have a different texture to them, but I think the blue creature decks, you do feel like you're playing a distinctly different kind of deck when you play against them.
And, I was playing a little bit of devil's advocate with that question, obviously, because we did that blue episode, and one of the things we noted is that full-on control, like just tap-go control, doesn't quite work because eventually your opponent will stick something, and if you don't have an answer for it, you weren't able to counter it, it is going to beat you down. So it makes sense that the blue threats need to be pushed just a little bit without being on par with the threats from other colors so that you can close out a game in a timely fashion, so that you can put a clock on your opponent, because you can't just sit back and rely on countering anything anymore. That's just not a playstyle that works quite well. So you do need something that pressures your opponent back. And, Malcolm doesn't kill your opponent in 5 turns. It kills your opponent in 10 turns. But you can back your counter magic up with a threat or two, like Vendilion Click, like Brazen Borrower, like Malcolm or whatever, and actually get a clock on your opponent, and then play kind of the counter strategy as a supplement there. And that's differentiate in tempo from control there.
Your counter magic feels a lot better when you're sitting with a Click or a Svalin in play. It just...
Yeah. Go and cancel on turn 3. I traded my cancel for your 3-mana spell, and that was the entire turn cycle. Feels so much better when you have Malcolm on board, when you have Fairy Mastermind on board, because that whole turn cycle happening, but you also clocked your opponent for 2 damage.
And you're shaping your hand to boot.
This was explicitly why we include Dismiss and Exclude in our cube, is that the control decks, especially Exclude, can leave open their counter magic on turn 3 and not feel like they got a short end of the stick, right? Because if you cancel, that's not very good. But excluding is sometimes backbreaking on 3.
Yeah, I mean, and that's also a testament to the fact that we just don't have the best counter magic in Magic's history that we're playing those cards. We'd much prefer Dismiss to be Cryptic Command. But, part of the reason we're including those cards is, basically every color gets, 3 2-for-1s now, and, we felt like blue needed a couple in order to keep pace. And, one of the other reasons that Exclude works in our cube is that we're a very creature-heavy environment. So, sometimes you're going to miss a Planeswalker, sometimes you're going to miss a removal spell, but your opponent on 3 a lot of the time is going to be playing a creature, and countering that and drawing cards pretty backbreaking. So speaking of Svalin, Tim, I wanted to ask you, we've been talking about flash creatures a lot. What makes a sorcery speed creature viable in aggro control?
It needs to give you some sort of recurrent advantage, right? You need to be able to tap out and make sure if you untap with it that you're getting at least a card's worth of advantage off of it. Otherwise, why tap out when you're incentivized to play at instant speed? And we get a lot more cards like this now. I'm going to beat it to death, but Subterranean Schooner is the perfect example. You're tapping out on turn 2, or whatever turn you play it in, and you're saying to your opponent, okay, I'm going to give you a reprieve from me doing anything at instant speed, but if I untap with this card, I'm going to get a ton of advantage off of it. Svalin is the same thing. Svalin is the 3/4 1 blue merfolk, which is only playable if you have other merfolk in your environment.
Somehow that card has been went from one that we were like kind of questioning whether it would even be playable to being like the best blue finisher in the cube outside of maybe Sea Shark. It's just like so good.
Tel's greatest contribution to the cube might be that he mentioned Svalin as a possible good card, and then it turned out it was an excellent card. But it is the type of thing, like, it doesn't have flash. Thank God, but it is a 3/4 first off, so it's really good at blocking the turn it comes down.
Overstated in blue is a big deal.
Yeah.
Overstated in blue didn't used to happen.
Exactly. Overstated in blue is more important than overstated in any other color, because the other colors are rife with overstated creatures, so it's just take your pick of the litter, whereas in blue, you need that defensive option to untap with your creature. But if you untap with Svalin, now you've got a draw engine that actually is clocking your opponent too, because for some reason it's a 3/4 because Modern Horizons, I guess. Right. I don't know. I don't get the design of the card, but it is a very good card, and it is something that is worth tapping out for. Whereas if you're not playing cards like that, if your blue threats are like vanilla creatures, like why are those even in the cube if you have to tap out for that sort of thing? I will say another type of card that I'm noticing is worth tapping out for in your tempo decks are the ones that give you some sort of onboard mana sink.
Tim's finally coming around on Surge Engine, guys. Here's his.
I was going to mention Surge Engine, which everybody here unanimously agrees is a garbage card, but it gives you it's somewhere to put the mana. The same thing as you would like holding up a counter spell on a flash creature. Just instead of the flash creature, it's something on board that you can sink your mana into. And I think the example that we have now, like the prime example of this, is Sleep Cursed Fairy, which is a card that you can just free reroll out on turn one. You know, not too many bad things are going to happen on turn one. It's not going to be a relevant threat till later in the game, but on turn two, the play pattern that we kind of tried to eke out before actually playing with the card was, I have my counter spell on turn two. My opponent didn't play anything or give me an opportunity to counter anything, but now I get to use my mana on this Sleep Cursed Fairy instead. And, Surge Engine is not my favorite card in the world, but it does fit that category of, it gives you something to do with your mana if the counter spell is not relevant. And there aren't too many other cards like that. I can't even think of one where you can just sink mana into it otherwise. But if we get more cards like Sleep Cursed Fairy, those are the type of cards that play well in these tempo decks. Even though they're not like pressuring your opponent immediately, they play into the strategy very well.
Sleep Cursed Fairy is such an excellent deal when it does untap, like a 3/3 flyer with, what does it have, Ward 2? It's just such a good deal for 1 mana, which actually brings me to another point, which is your sorcery speed threats, unless they create really snowball advantage like Svalin, you really want them to cost like 2 mana. And part of the reason for that is, I might have mentioned it earlier, but like turn 4 is a really big turn for these decks, because you can sneak out a sorcery speed threat for 2 mana and still hold up a Doomblade or a counterspell.
Yeah.
Right.
In the spots where you don't have Sleep Cursed Fairy on 1, like the optimal line we've discovered is you don't play it on 2, you just wait till turn 3 and then you play it plus hold up a 2 mana counter. And then you're kind of in the same spot as turn 1, just a little delayed.
So it's worth noting too, we're talking about all these flash threats in place to sink your mana. You'll notice we're not talking about, like, we haven't mentioned a single card like Torrential Gearhulk or Sublime Epiphany, or Shark Typhoon kind of fits into tempo decks well enough, but these decks don't want a 6-drop, right? They do want to kill your opponent in a reasonable time, and sometimes a card will sneak in, but just to differentiate further, the blue control decks from the blue tempo decks, usually the divide and line for me is those big finisher type cards you're not as interested in.
I think it depends. Like, I've seen Kenji draft blue-white decks in like Vintage Cube that I would kind of describe as tempo decks that will play Torrential Gearhulk, but that's because those environments feature a lot of fast mana, so you can go bigger. You know what I mean? And like quote unquote like fair cubes, especially like fair cubes like ours that don't have access to like the talismans or like whatever the ones that people played before, you generally speaking want to be a little smaller.
One of the defining features we've seen out of every time these cards or these decks are standard playable is the aggro control decks don't mind typically playing a kind of more expensive form of card advantage. But then they use all of these cards to be, they use these really efficient cards, 1 to 3 mana, in order to leverage the fact that they wasted a bunch of mana drawing cards, and they try to reclaim that by playing cheap threats. Whereas your control decks are looking to play, even though they've gotten leaner, they're going to play Gear Hulk and like 3 5-drops or something like that to try to win the game. Whereas your aggro control deck might play like 1 Memory Deluge / Behold the Multiverse, and then like an Avacyn, and that's the extent of their top end, and everything else in the deck costs 3 or less. Even though it is a deck that can kind of grind, it grinds by playing cheap, efficient cards.
One of the things that I wanted to mention as well, one of the major reasons that I prefer building the blue quote-unquote creature deck as an aggro control deck as opposed to one of these disruptive aggro decks, is not only that they mesh better with control cards, so they're inherently kind of less parasitic to your cube design, but I think that they scale much better into higher power cubes. Because your blue disruptive aggro deck is like not very fast, so combo players like don't really give a shit what you're doing, and they're just going to combo you out before you can kill them. And you're already soft to the aggro deck, so there's just like a bigger spread of decks that your disruptive aggro deck that's playing like creatures to the board and like trying to leverage like curiosities and things are just like not nearly as good. I think that the aggro control deck scales a lot better into higher power environments, like even maybe like legacy cube environments, because like counterspells are counterspells, and like flash 2/1 flyers are flash 2/1 flyers. Like they will win games. Counterspells just counter things no matter what they are, right? Like you can disrupt combo with an aggro control deck. You can disrupt good mid-range decks with an aggro control deck. So I think that they just kind of inherently scale better into higher power environments if you're thinking about having a blue creature deck in your very powerful cube.
They absolutely do. If you look at Vintage Cube, the blue creature decks in Vintage Cube were kind of doing that thing, right? They usually were disruptive blue creatures usually with flash plus counter magic. But also another advantage is that these decks sideboard a lot better than your Flying Man decks do, because usually with these aggro control style decks, you don't really have a lot of cards in the deck that are necessary to the game plan for any specific matchup. They all play a role in helping the deck, but you don't have these slots that you have to play your 6 flying men or, you know, your 2 curiosity effects or whatever. So you can adjust your sideboard a lot more effectively to what your opponent's doing after game 1, which is a big advantage.
I'm really in love with this style. The blue tempo deck has been sort of a pet deck of mine as a designer for a really long time. Tim mentioned Lantern Bearer when we were doing the Flagman thing. I was a huge Lantern Bearer stan, and Theo made so much fun of me for putting that card in the cube. And like I said, it's slowly just as we got more of these flash creatures and kind of learned lessons from cubing every single week and like seeing how this deck performed, it's sort of evolved into the style. So I know that we've taken a dive into the ins and outs of this deck, but it's just hard for me to not talk extensively about this deck because I just really love it. And we're finally at a point where like the blue-white version is actually 3-0ing with a fair degree of regularity, and it's been played with great success in some of our roto drafts as well. So like it's really there at this point.
Yeah, and it's very distinctly not a true control deck. It almost always ends up being like this Restoration Angel, Snapcaster Mage, creature-y. It like plays all these flash creatures, right? And it is very distinctly a creature control deck, which is its unique space in the cube. And it's anytime I really fall in love with Constructed, it's with one of these blue creature decks when they come up, and they don't come up super frequently, but that's basically like when you'll find me playing Constructed pretty aggressively is when these decks are good.
We've gotten recently, especially in this last set, we have been receiving a lot of excellent cards for this aggro control kind of style. Do you want to take us through some of them?
I mean, we talked about Subterranean Schooner ad nauseum here. I have to imagine that card might be like an all-timer, just because of how pushed it is. And we talked about it on our review episode about how all of the knobs were in the right space for this to be good, to the point where I think like it's overtuned, having played against it in limited. Like you go turn 2 Schooner, you can't kill it with a sorcery speed removal, you can't wrath it. Even if your out is a wrath, your opponent can just top deck another creature because it has crew 1, so anything can crew it.
Strong Lunar Schooner vibes.
Yeah, people were making the joke, oh, it's the new Smuggler's Copter, but it kind of is the new Smuggler's Copter. So Schooner's great. Another big one that I mentioned but haven't really talked about is Kitesail Larcenist. Larcenist is the 3 mana 2/3 flyer with Ward 1 that turns something your opponent controls into a treasure when it enters the battlefield. And those Banisher Priest style creatures are usually good tempo cards, right? Because your opponent eventually gets their advantage back. Like the Banisher Priest type cards do die at some point in the game and your opponent gets back whatever they had. But this one actually pushes damage quite well. It has Ward 1, so Ward is probably something we should mention in the tempo episode too, is that Ward kind of forces your opponent to overpay for their mana, which means that you end up getting a mana advantage. The cheaper the card is with Ward, the more likely you are that you're going to get a mana advantage off of it, like Sleep Cursed Fairy is a good example. I paid 1 mana for that card. Your opponent has to pay, what, minimum 3 mana to use an instant or sorcery to kill that, and you spend 1 mana on the card. You probably dumped extra mana into it. So Ward threats are great. Malcolm, we've talked about that, is just Flash Flyer, and that one even loots. I didn't even mention the looting when I was talking about that card, but these 2 mana Flash Flyers are good. Stern Scolding is a nice one that we picked up from Lord of the Rings.
Card's completely insane. Like, it is one of the best counter spells printed in a long time.
That's a blue mana instant counter target creature spell with power or toughness 3 or less?
2 or less.
2 or less, which hits, I think, in our cube. Now that Adeline's gone, I think it hits literally every single 1-drop and 2-drop in the cube, except Sleep Cursed Fairy, and hits a wide number of 3s and 4s, and it's very easy to get a mana advantage off of that. And then Reprieve, which is like slowly creeping up to White's best card somehow, you know, behind Swords to Plowshares, Wandering Emperor. Reprieve is just like a classic tempo card. Remand is a classic tempo counter spell that's even better in a tempo deck than it is in a control deck because, again, you're leveraging damage. And there's other tempo cards we could talk about here, but those were the ones that came to mind, especially from the last couple sets.
One other one that I think is really exciting was one of the handful of alchemy cards we've actually decided to include in the cube, which is the Talion's...
I'll bleep this part out. Go.
What'd you say?
I'll bleep this part out.
Oh, yeah. I know I'm speaking blasphemy here, but Talion's Throne Guard is like a flying Venser of sorts and could have absolutely been printed as a paper card and looks like it's going to be extremely fun to play with. And from what I've heard, it's played quite well without being like crazy oppressive or anything.
Venser is a good tempo card. It hits that 4 mana slot like your Dismiss, your Cryptic Command, where it lets you interact and get on board.
But notably, this one has the extra mechanic we like to have all of our blue creatures, which is flying.
It has that. It has the magic word flying on it. It can't hit lands like Venser, but I don't like that Venser's just like a 2/2 on the ground.
Well, I was gonna say it's a strict upside that it can't hit lands, right? It's like that's just good for gameplay.
Yeah, from a play pattern perspective,
it's a better play experience for sure.
And like, it's just more likely to contribute to damage.
Am I missing any of the big tempo cards here that we've picked up over the last couple sets?
I'm sure that there are more, but like, I think that this is a pretty good spread just to demonstrate that, like, I mean, all of these cards are from this year.
So with that being said, that's kind of the general idea of tempo, how to slot it into cube and stuff like that. I know Teld wanted to briefly touch on something, but my question to you guys as kind of a closing statement here is, with everything kind of pushing towards larger stat lines, more pushed creatures, blue is now getting in on the aggro game. Like, this is kind of more of an incendiary question on purpose, but is there a such thing as like mid-range anymore, or is tempo the new mid-range? You know, is every deck a tempo deck? Like, if you go hard aggro on one side of the gradient and then hard control on the other side of the gradient. It used to be that everybody defined everything in between as mid-range, with a couple decks that were, you know, defined or called tempo, but it feels like so many decks in Magic, whether we're talking about constructed or cube or limited, fall into what we've been talking about here today, which is tempo rather than mid-range. So is mid-range dead? Is there such thing as mid-range? Is it all tempo now? Or
I don't think so.
Is there something you would say that differentiates like tempo from mid-range? Is mid-range still holding on in some fashion?
I mean, Jund and Red Black Rock are still very much alive in our cube just because they keep printing extremely high quality red and black cards. And I mean, Red Black mid-range was a dominant force in Standard for a really long time. So I think mid-range decks like still exist for sure.
I think for constructed purposes, you can still have the like kind of attrition tempo discussion, but I think in cube and limited and specific, like every format is functionally defined by tempo. And while there may be decks that can achieve attrition game states, it's not really something even optimal in a lot of spots, because when you get to this we're both top decking spot of the game, it's like you find yourself soft to a number of things your opponent can top deck. I think decks are just more likely to not run out of cards before you or your opponent have died. Even in these red black rock decks, a lot of times you just like play stuff and then your opponent still has cards in their hand and they just die, right? You like kill them with a Glissa or something.
That's true.
I don't think mid-range is dead. I just think the game has gotten so fast. We've moved from a game that was functionally more about card advantage and attrition, and we've moved to a game that is fundamentally about tempo. And it's just going to keep getting more and more noticeable the more that they push down the cost of extremely powerful cards. And while I don't think Magic's ever going to be able to get to like Yu-Gi-Oh level of speed, the amount of speed increase in the game we've seen in the last 5 years is super concerning in that regard.
One comment I want to sneak in here is I'm very happy to see these higher quality blue threats being printed, because it's facilitated the aggro control deck in our cube. But I am concerned that they're going to continue to push blue threats, and we're not going to see them push blue cards that are a lot better in control decks. So I'm a little wary of seeing this trend where we've been consistently getting good blue creatures. Because like one of the things I think that's going on right now, and I had this discussion with somebody on the subreddit, was, and I think Teld's on this train too, I don't think that the 4-mana draw 2s are even particularly good anymore. I think I'd rather play like a 1-mana cantrip over a 4-mana draw 2 like every time, because it feels like things have become a lot less about pure card advantage and a lot more for control decks of having the right card at the right time, which when you're getting like green cards like Radagast that just like 2/5 for 4 that just comes down and immediately impulses and draws a creature, and if you don't kill it, like does it again every time you play a creature. Like when you compare that card to like a Memory Deluge, I'm sinking 4 mana into like looking at 4 cards and drawing 2. Radagast produces a 2/5 blocker that's just going to continue to draw threats. I personally would never make the argument that Memory Deluge is a better way to get card advantage than like a card that produces a decent sized creature that draws cards is. You know what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. So I would like to see some more blue cards that are pure card advantage cards, but just keep up with the power of what threats that generate card advantage are doing. Like, just give me like instant speed 4-mana draw 3 already.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's too pushed, but I mean, it feels like that's kind of like pure card advantage spells need a push to still be good. They're starting to show their age.
My absolute hope is that we would tap the brakes at some point, but I acknowledge that's probably never happening.
Yeah, I think that would be an easy solution, is to not print every, 3-mana card as a 3/4 or whatever, or make it super resilient to removal. But
yeah, that's what they're doing though.
It feels like they recognize that cards have gotten stronger, and the solution is to make the newest cards that come out after that stronger than those, so that they can compete, rather than like taking a minute to let those cards be the strongest cards and dial back on the power level, especially with this newest set. Like, LCI is a hyper powerful set in terms of like just the stat lines and the amount of value on your 3-drops and stuff like that. But I do see, to Chris's point, it feels like somebody at Wizards has recognized blue control not doing great, traditional counter spell, draw spell, control not doing great. But the solution that they've come up with, instead of making the counter spells and the draw spells better, has been to push blue into the same territory that's making the other colors good, which is, efficient creature territory. And it's not, it's fine for blue to have efficient creatures, but it would be nice to, play into blue's biggest strengths, quote unquote, according to the color pie, which is like your card advantage, your counter spells and stuff like that, your stack interaction, which blue is no longer the king of, card advantage. I think we talked about that in the blue episode. Definitively, I would say blue is not the card advantage king anymore.
I do sort of wonder, with the recent printing of Cavern of Souls into Standard, if that signals that they're about to ramp up the power level of counter magic, because they gave such a hard hoser for it.
Yeah, I don't understand why they needed to give us that. It's just
egregious. Cavern of Souls right off the back of Delighted Halfling for like Eternal.
I know, why does Eternal? Anyway, we're way off topic at this point, but like, why does Delighted Halfling make legendary spells uncounterable? Like, why?
Makes your planeswalkers uncounterable.
Like why? Why? It's such a throwaway line of text against anything but blue decks. I just don't get it. Anyway.
Yeah, it's rough. Do you think we're going to get a set that just doesn't have a counterspell in it?
Oh, Lord.
I hope not. I hope not.
I don't know. They'll probably give us Disdainful Stroke at the very least.
You know what is a little encouraging, though? They printed that out of air card, and, like, we decided to pass on it because we weren't sure that, like, the blue was too restrictive versus, like, traditional Essence Scatter. But it's possible that we should just try it and see for ourselves, because, like, I think, even though, like, we're not sure about that counterspell, I think giving us a modal counterspell that can tag, like, creatures or non-creatures, and it's, like, modal, like, it is a common, like, it probably could have been a little bit more pushed at rare, but, like, it looks like they're experimenting with making counterspells a little bit better, maybe, or a little bit more interesting, so I hope they keep doing
Trickery
that.
And Confound and Riddle as just a straight-up strictly better Supreme Will, you know, is a nod to, hey, counterspells need to be a little bit better.
I mean, we say this, but then they also printed a card that turns a map token into a 5/4 that puts another card into play if you manage to kill it. Like, I mean, like that
Sure,
like the blue creature direction is much more the likelihood here, right? Like Zoetic Glyph is the like, that's kind of where we're at, right? It's like Out of Air is like a conditionally marginal upgrade on Essence Scatter, and Zoetic Glyph is just like way better than any version of this effect we've seen.
Yeah, you're probably right. But anyway, like I said, we've gotten completely off topic. We should probably go ahead and wrap it up here. Hopefully we've interested you in an aggro control deck if you're not currently trying one, and if you're playing like a traditional, relatively unthemed cube, and your entire blue section is either dedicated to control or like supporting the other colors, you probably have room to try one, and they're really fun. So I would encourage anybody, even at higher power levels, who isn't playing a deck like this, like, maybe give it a try. It's a fun alternative way to play blue that still very much feels like a blue deck. So yeah, just throwing it out there. Like, if you haven't tested a deck like this, I think it's totally testable. And yeah, just I encourage you to try it out.
Yeah, and I mean, shameless plug, if you want to come try it out with us, we do have Tempo as a supported archetype in our cube. You can do blue-white Tempo, or Telt's favorite, mono-green Craterhoof Behemoth Tempo with all the mana dorks. But that's going to go ahead and do it. Thanks, as always, to everybody who's joined us today to listen to us talk about Tempo. Remember that the best way to support Jank Diver Gaming and the Jank Tank right now is to join our Discord server. Wherever you're listening to this, there will be a link to that. Come draft with us, give us your feedback. It's a great place to hang out with like-minded individuals and talk about Cube, Retail Limited. You can listen to Teld's rants about how LCI is the worst format since WoW. You can talk about all things Magic here. So we draft our more powerful unrestricted cube on Sundays at 7:30 Eastern. We also have a pretty consistent 3:30 Eastern time slot that's been popping off on Sundays as well. So we get our European drafters in for the early ones, and then we get our American drafters in for our 7:30 time slot, and you know, basically it's the same people plus like one European guy who shows up.
Really, the 3:30 slot is our variety slot. That's where we run all the experimental cubes people like to brew.
Yeah, and if you have a cube that you think is really good and is arena viable, come pitch it to us, and we might be able to put it on the schedule. We actually played, was it Unlucky Looter's Desert Cube?
Yeah, that was sweet.
Which is a cube where you have to draft your lands. People seem to have a lot of fun with that, and I know we've got another person who's, I think, developing a Charm-type cube as a pitch that they want to play with us, which is like a cube where every card is modal, so maybe that's going to be overload for the brain. But we'll see if they can shape it up a little bit. We'll see if we can get it on the schedule. But otherwise, Peasant Cube on Wednesday, Unrestricted Cube on Sunday. And as always, you can find links to our Discord server wherever you're listening to this. Check out the socials: Twitter at JankDiverGaming and YouTube.com/JankDiverGaming, where I have a really sweet Lost Caverns of Ixalan draft up currently. We also post all of our podcasts there, and I think Chris was going to get some Brawl content on there.
Oh my god, I've tried to record like 2 Brawl deck videos because I actually really love my like Rakdos Artifact Ramp like mid-range deck. But both times I've gone to record, I've just like made a couple of misplays that were so egregious that I was just like, I can't put this video.
You got to get the misplays on there, man.
No. One of them was really, really bad and resulted in my opponent
like you stone rained yourself.
No, like I didn't read my opponent didn't concede because they wanted to give me an opportunity to make a mistake, and I totally did. I did not read that our Boreal Grazer has reach. And they were on 4, and I just attacked my 5-power flyer into their reach creature, even though like I had a removal spell in my hand. And they followed it up with a Bant Tameo ult, and then they time twisted and like played 4 free cards, and I managed somehow to still win that game. Like, I still have no idea how I won that game, but like, Jesus, it was just.
I think the people need to see this.
It was just such an embarrassing misplay. I don't know, man. I don't know. It was really bad. It filled me with a deep shame.
You might not put it up there, but there's no guarantees that person wasn't recording and is putting it up somewhere else anyway.
That is the definition of content playing. That is content gaming, my friend.
Well, you know what the worst part about it? The worst part about it was I had in 2 separate games played Breaches on 3, and it was like in both games it like made 2 treasures and then drew 2 cards before it got bricked, which is like you can't really, and it had chipped in like 12 damage, and you like really can't ask for a whole lot more than that. And I just like I wanted to showcase that card had been really good even in a format as powerful as Historic Brawl, and when I made that horrible misplay, I was just like, fuck, I can't use this video.
Well, you can edit it out. Oh, no, my recording messed up for the last 10 minutes. We're back for game 2. Anyway, if you want to listen to Teld, twitch.tv/Teld Talks is the place to find him. He usually streams.
You can find me, Teld, talking.
Yes, Teld will be there talking on Teld Talks. Nice little tempo discussion there. Derailed for the last 20 minutes, but you got to get those in there too. But thanks for hanging out, y'all. Hope to hear from you soon. We'll have another episode in a couple weeks, and we'll catch you next time.
All right. So what's our sign-off?
All right. This is going to be very quick. I actually have to look something up real quick, but this is my new gripe, my new soapbox complaint about Magic design, which is a new segment called Why the Hell Does This Card Have Ward?
Are we starting with, what's it, Wandering Throne? Is that the name of the card?
Well, I don't want to get into too much detail here and spend a lot of time, but I'm glad you actually mentioned Sleep Curse Fairy, because that's a good use of Ward, right? That's just a good use of Ward because that card takes a lot of time. But let's go to LCI real quick, and let's look up the Oracle Text Ward. And that will pull up, first off, 9 cards with Ward.
Nice.
In this set, 7 of which have Ward 2 or greater. And the reason I hate this is because every instance of Ward here is a card that you need to untap with for it to be good. There's Roaming Throne, there's Hulking Raptor, there's Sovereign Okina Kahau, there's Abuelo. Duskrose Reliquary is a good use of Ward, but my least favorite trend right now, aside from just pushing stat lines over the top, is the idea that creatures don't need to die, or that everything needs to survive to do the thing it does. Because, you know, the whole dies to Doomblade argument is basically a way of saying if it doesn't have an ETB and doesn't give you immediate value, that it's not worth playing. Well, yeah. It feels like they've taken that to heart, and the way to compensate is just to put a really high Ward number on a card to guarantee that it survives to the point where it gets to do the thing that it gets to do. And my thing is like, isn't it okay if creatures die? Like, isn't it fine if a creature, if your big, super powerful, overstated card doesn't live to get to do the thing? Like, isn't that fine?
Yeah, it's definitely fine.
So, I mean, Roman Throne is a 4-mana 4/4, which is already hard enough to kill. And this is mostly geared towards limited, obviously, but you put a Ward 2 card in cube, and suddenly your opponent's efficient mana is no longer efficient. But, like, on top of push stat lines, these cards all have super powerful abilities you need to untap with. And I feel like the push and pull there is, if I need to untap with something and my reward is I get a really good card, then the drawback should be that if my card dies, I don't get that that big reward. I mean, it's not as egregious as Hexproof or Shroud or anything like that, or Protection. But Ward basically cancels out, like, the pushback or the pullback of, like, you know, push and pull card design, where it's like, okay, you don't get immediate value, but you're going to get your value anyway because your opponent can't kill this card. And it's super annoying and limited where people are playing like Rumble and Rock Slide as their removal spell, which is already 4 mana.
It's pretty egregious in limited, but I think this is probably more slanted towards constructed. And this is where like limited and constructed are fundamentally at odds, because the cards that don't have ETB effects or like extremely powerful ward abilities don't really see play in constructed on average. And so I think this is like a consideration of making it harder to kill for formats where they have access to lots and lots of 1 and 2 mana removal. And then,
yeah,
like, but I do agree with you, for retail limited, it's pretty obnoxious.
It makes removal so bad that, like, removal's already bad against two. Like, 1-for-1 removal is bad against 2-for-1 creatures. And now you're making, like, you're pushing ward onto all of these super powerful things. I'm not saying any of these cards are, like, constructed all-stars or anything like that. But removal's already bad against the best threats. Why do we need to make removal bad against, you know, the threats that don't give you immediate value? Like, let removal be fine. Like, it's 1-for-1, and it's okay for creatures to die.
I think it's more noticeable in this set because the removal is trash. It's like, if the removal was more efficient and good, like it has been in the last few sets, it probably wouldn't be quite as bad. Like, when your removal is 4 and 5 mana, it's just like, almost like a why play removal.
Yeah, my one loss at the Ixalan pre-releases was to this Sovereign Okina Kahal card, which is the green-white cat thing that, if its power is bigger than its base power, like, it gets even bigger, so it attacks as like a 7-power creature on the first turn while pumping anything else that's bigger. My opponent played turn 3 Sanguine Evangelist into this, and I was looking at Rumble and Rock Slide in my hand, and it's like, well, I have the removal, but I can't kill your thing. Super annoying. I feel like some of these designs would be more interesting if they just didn't have a protection ability on top of them, so that there was a bit of push and pull instead of everything gets to do the thing that it's designed to do.
Isn't the flip side of that playing in WoW where, like, Torch the Tower was so good that you're supposed to take it over almost anything that is an Immodange recruiter?
If you're going to make every card resilient to removal, then you have to push the removal. This is literally like textbook power creep, right?
It's an arms race.
Yeah, and then, the removal's really good now. Now green needs 4 5s for 3 to survive the removal spells.
One of the things I used to praise Magic pretty extensively for was that they experimented more with horizontal design rather than vertical design, which is to say that cards didn't necessarily get more powerful consistently over time. They did, like, over large periods, but, like, from set to set, they didn't necessarily get more powerful. They just experimented with cards doing different things for different decks. And that meant the power creep was, like, slow and gradual. And it feels like in the last 2 years, it's just been every set had to be more powerful than the last one immediately.
Well, it used to be that a classic mythic rare design would be to take 2 old effects that we've seen and combine them on one card somehow and stat it appropriately, you know, and give it a mana cost that's maybe a little bit more expensive than either of those individual effects. Like a classic example is Prophet of Krufix, which combines, you know, the Seedborn Muse ability and the Vidalcan Orrery ability, but you pay 5 mana for one card instead of 9 mana total for 2 cards. And that's how cards used to be designed, to make, like, a cool splashy mythic. And now it feels like you give them a super powerful ability, you throw a ridiculous stat line on them, and you make them super resilient. And this is the same set that has these gods that if you kill them, just turn back into the god, right? So it's a little rough. Trust me, next time new set comes out, we will revisit Why the Hell Does This Have Ward, Part 2.
And remember, we're like 2.5, 3 weeks away from con, so, you know, we're almost there. We're almost there. We only have to put up with LCI for a few more weeks.
It's not that bad, but yeah, cons is going to be a big one. We will have we'll talk about that off air, but we'll have some sort of set review style thing for cons, though. We kind of know how the cards operate.
I don't remember the last time I actively hated a set this bad. I didn't think WoW was great, but I thought it was kind of mid, but this set is rough. It is real rough.
It's because Ward 2. It's Ward 2. It's killing you, man.
Blue's the new white.
What do we do?
Techno, baby.